Probably known to many of you in some form. There's some great videos of Martin online. I very much like I'm going to say post mushrooms, but the video that's sort of after other chemicals to study than magic mushrooms.
Oh, right,
my favourite.
Sorry, I thought
What's the title?
Post mushrooms.
No, I've never seen you post mushrooms.
Beyond psilocybin.
Beyond psilocybin. That's my favourite talk from Martin, but I have seen many. Martin is the executive director and co-founder of PRISM, which is psychedelic research in science and medicine. This organisation's been running since about 2008. Yep. 2011. It really is considered one of the most important psychedelic organisations in Australia, and has a very long history and a great. The people that make up this organisation are fantastic. So I'm lucky enough to have been involved with Martin in the organisation. So thank you for your work, Martin. Martin has been the co-lead on the St Vincent's Hospital, Melbourne, Phase 2 trial for psilocybin-assisted therapy for depression and anxiety. I can never say that word properly. Anxiety, there you go. And I always muck that one up. Associated with terminal illness, and we'll go with that one. You're also the co-investigator on
Melbourne's multi-institution.
There you go. There is. So one psilocybin study, one MDMA study, and I know for sure Martin's worked on many other studies, if not as a mentor to many of the studies that are currently going in Australia. So I'm going to introduce Martin Williams, and I can only take my hat off and say that he's the most respected researcher in Melbourne, in Australia, that I know.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ronnie. You'd probably better get out of it and start meeting a few other researchers. It's great. It just feels so good to be back on Bunjalung country. It feels like coming home every time I come back up here. So, although if we could shift some of the rain from here down south, that would be really helpful. I've come up from Melbourne and it's been bone dry for quite a while. Of course, I'd really like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, this evening. So I'm never afraid to stick my neck out a bit, and I'm going to be talking about a field that I'm not directly necessarily particularly well qualified in, and that's more the legal sort of the status of psilocybin and magic mushrooms around the world. I thought it might be an interesting topic to cover here, because of course the parallels and some significant contrasts with cannabis activism and cannabis decrim and legalisation in Australia and beyond. So I thought it might just be interesting to work through a few examples of what's going on globally in relation to psilocybin. I guess many of you would be aware that psilocybin has been the major focus of psychedelic medical research in the world for probably about 10, 15, maybe even 20 years now. I'd say there's a few reasons for that which are quite easy to comprehend. One is psilocybin is it's a natural product, it's a non-threatening compound, it doesn't have the political baggage that LSD acid developed through the late 60s into the early 70s. And so psilocybin was really deliberately and strategically selected as a favoured compound in the medical field, in the medical sphere, for the treatment of mental health conditions. For a few reasons that I've just mentioned, but a couple of others. Psilocybin exerts a relatively short duration of action compared with LSD, for the same sort of intensity of experience, and it shows itself to be quite sort of therapeutically tractable and useful. And so I was interested to see how that's playing out, because in Australia, as I'll be discussing in a few minutes' time, there's been a very significant development in the last 2 to 3 years, and you may be aware that psilocybin has been rescheduled by the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia to enable prescription by authorised prescribers who are psychiatrists, plus that cohort may change a little bit and broaden in the next little while. Prescription of psilocybin expressly for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression in the context of psychotherapy. And so Australia perhaps surprisingly and perhaps almost unwillingly, is now leading the world in terms of the legal sort of developments around psychedelics. And so this is where we're heading today. The snapshot of psilocybin in the sort of the global legal sort of context is it's quite a colourful world map, this one. Obviously red is the predominant colour throughout, and particularly through Eurasia, and that is essentially psilocybin is strictly illegal in most of those countries, Europe, all of Africa essentially, and quite a lot of East Asia certainly, and Southeast Asia. There's some ambiguity, I guess, in the legal status of psilocybin in countries such as Australia, India, Canada, and some parts of Europe. And that's really quite interesting because this sort of, to me, represents that rather sort of mixed and unclear sort of differentiation between decriminalisation of drugs on the one hand and legalisation or legal application on the other. There's really only a tiny handful of countries where psilocybin is actually fully legal, and those are Brazil and Peru, as you can see there, and Nepal, of all places. There's a couple of others in the Caribbean, but otherwise it's pretty lean pickings for just a fully legal sort of status. But then there's also this interesting landscape in the USA, and I'll be going into that in a little bit of detail later. You can see that there are 3 states there where psilocybin is actually decriminalised, and it's also legal for medical use. And I don't want to labour that point too much, but it will be very interesting to explore this sort of, again, this contrast between decriminalisation, how that can be reconciled with legalisation, and that essentially goes hand in hand with the medical application, medicalisation of psychedelics. Can you guys hear me okay? My voice isn't super strong today, sorry. So just historically speaking, psilocybin, you may be aware, is the prodrug. It's the more stable form of psilocin, and that stability is conferred just simply by a little extra sort of component in the molecule. It's a phosphate group, which is at the 4th position of the hydroxy group of psilocin. Both of those compounds are biosynthesized in certain species of mushrooms, particularly psilocybe genera and some related genera of mushrooms around the world. And anybody who saw Kane's talk a little bit earlier will see just how fascinating that field in itself is. But psilocybin and psilocin were caught up, along with a whole lot of other compounds, around that sort of late 60s into the early 70s period, when psychedelics unfortunately got quite a bad name globally, particularly led by the US and its essential sort of war on counterculture. And so psilocybin and psilocin were regulated by these United Nations treaties. Specifically, they were placed in Schedule 1 in the United Nations International Convention on Psychotropic Substances. Now, the mushrooms themselves, as it happens, are not regulated by the United Nations treaties. However, quite a number of countries have nonetheless sort of grabbed the mushrooms as natural materials on this God-given earth, and nonetheless drawn them into that sort of scheduling sort of process, that legal sort of tangle. Now, cultivation of psilocybin-containing mushrooms is considered drug manufacture in quite a lot of jurisdictions around the world, and in many cases the criminal penalties for possession of, and particularly cultivation of, psilocybin-containing mushrooms can be as severe, if not more severe, than possession of the active components themselves. And it gets pretty curly, actually, in New South Wales. It turns out that somebody who is arrested with a particular quantity of mushroom is deemed by the legal system to be carrying that quantity of psilocybin, even though the content of psilocybin in dried mushrooms is perhaps 1–1.5% by weight. But nonetheless, the legal system really scandalously, in my opinion, catches people in that sort of way. Very unfortunate. Now, I'm going to go through just a few countries by name, primarily, I guess, just to give you a bit of a sense of the range of different approaches that different countries have. And of course, there'd be historical reasons for that, there'd be current political reasons, and there's hopefully going to be a number of reasons for sort of progress and development in some countries, probably more quickly than others. But it's quite an interesting sort of landscape that we're looking at here. So in fact, in Switzerland, psilocybin is, as you can see in that top little strip, illegal in most contexts, but it's largely actually also decriminalised. And this probably represents a particular relationship that Switzerland, or the Swiss, have with the certain areas of medicine, certain histories of psychedelics and psychoactive substances, and also I'd venture to say a very pragmatic approach to drug law reform and to understanding where these compounds may fit into their society as a whole. We can also dig a little. Are there any Swiss in the audience? We could also dig a little bit into the Swiss sort of way of being, I guess, as a country. It's a fascinating country. And so, although these two compounds are listed as controlled substances, it's only relatively recently that the mushrooms themselves were banned. But interestingly enough, nonetheless, psilocybin is used actively in clinical research and in medical practice by qualified and approved psychiatrists in particular. And one thing that I neglected to put here, I'm sorry, is there's also what's called the compassionate use system for, in some parts of in some countries of the world, for the use of psilocybin for the treatment of people who may have no other treatment options. They may be terminally ill, experiencing existential distress, and the Swiss in particular have been quite accommodating of these particular situations, requirements of certain people. So the last line is quite interesting because, again, it seems that the Swiss approach to legal enforcement is very pragmatic. If they're saying, well, these rules and regulations haven't really led to any decrease in demand or consumption of these compounds or mushrooms at all, then it doesn't really make much sense to just keep banging away. Wouldn't it be great if politicians would listen a little more to that kind of logic, instead of feeling that by not trying to stamp them out, we're just tacitly encouraging? There's quite a bit of a gap in my opinion. Canada's very interesting because, again, although they're formally illegal in a sort of formal legal sense, there is a almost complete lack of enforcement of the regulations, the drug laws, particularly in the western side of the Canadian sort of subcontinent, I guess. Now, Canada has really sort of led the charge, I think, in terms again of pragmatism of the use of psychedelics and psilocybin in particular, in sort of just in the grassroots sort of down home medical sort of context. And so over that period, sort of last probably 8 to 10 years, there's been a significant increase in acceptability of the use of psilocybin, particularly for the treatment of severe mental health conditions related to terminal illness, so depression, anxiety, in some cases pain. And some people might have seen a couple of the documentaries which are very interesting coming out of Canada, sort of telling that story of how that's played out. I find it quite interesting also that Canada has now become the new go-to for companies to be synthesizing psilocybin and other psychedelics for export to other countries around the world. And in fact, it's formally prohibited in the United States to export any, as I understand it anyway, and my caveat is I'm not a legal expert, so please don't take what I'm I'm saying as absolute gospel, but my understanding is that it's prohibited to export Schedule 1 or sort of highly regulated prohibited substances, including psychedelics, from the US to other countries. And so Canada has become the one just over the border that is able to circumvent those international issues and export these compounds. There's also an interesting sort of possibility that Canada also has a big population of mining executives, and mining executives are very used to speculation on new ventures such as psychedelic development. And so it's quite possible, and in fact it's actually true, that quite a number of ex-mining executives are now leading Canadian psychedelic pharmaceutical companies. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. The Netherlands is interesting, of course, partly because of its history of allowing cannabis culture to develop in Amsterdam in particular, of course, not necessarily the rest of the Netherlands. But prior to that period in the end of 2008, the mushrooms themselves were not restricted under drug laws, and so there was something of a loophole, and it was quite an active sort of industry in the Netherlands right up to that sort of period of around 2008. But then things changed, and I think that might have been due to some pressure internationally on the Netherlands to start to close down its otherwise fairly flourishing psychoactive drug market. And so the prosecutor's office did essentially specify that psilocybin and mushrooms were then illegal. However, they have applied relatively lenient sort of, or relatively liberal sort of quantities as minimum quantities for them to try for prosecution. However, this little loophole emerged in the Netherlands, and there's the essentially little bundles of mycelia, which are known as truffles, psychoactive or magic truffles, have managed to slip through the net. And so, in fact, the Netherlands still has quite an active psilocybin sort of culture, and there is still an active psilocybin tourism, basically, where people, underground facilitators, are able to administer perfectly legally truffles and facilitate experiences in people. And it turns out that, as the story goes, Australia's change in regulations may have come about indirectly, partly through a facilitated truffle experience by a couple of people in the Netherlands. Brazil's quite a contrast because essentially everything's legal, mainly because there was no legal precedent in that jurisdiction to restrict mushrooms. And although Brazil is a signatory to the International Convention, and hence is in a formal sense required to list psilocybin and psilocin as illegal, there's no evidence that there's any enforcement of that legal framework on psilocybin and psilocin in Brazil. Brazil, of course, is one of the two main homes of ayahuasca, and so it's quite arguable, I guess, that Brazilian culture is more accommodating and accepting of this particular class of tryptamine psychedelic experiences as part of their deep sort of cultural sort of background and milieu. So Brazil's an interesting one because that was one of the really just the two big blue countries in the whole world that where psilocybin and psilocin are effectively legal for all comers. Jamaica is, again, a jurisdiction where psilocybin mushrooms, psilocin and psilocybin are effectively entirely legal. They don't have any history of illegality, and so essentially, as I said, there's no legal precedent for them to have been scheduled. And Jamaica was perhaps one of the countries for a period of time where fully legal medical retreats and medical centres were operating. In fact, I remember one person in Australia who was having trouble just prior to our change of regulations in Australia in seeking psilocybin treatment. And they basically said, well, stuff this, I'm just going to go to Jamaica. And as it turned out, it probably would have cost them less to have gone to Jamaica for mushroom experiences than it would have been to be staying in Australia for treatment with psilocybin. So the US is now an interesting and sort of it's a real patchwork, and I'll go into the reasons for that a little later. But as you can see, despite there being a very substantial amount of the current US continent that is, or country that's in which psilocybin and psilocin is still completely illegal, there has been this really quite interesting political process of changing the laws at various levels, from the federal or from the national to the state, and then even local levels. And so you can see that there are the two main states in which psilocybin and mushrooms are legal for supervised medical use, but also decriminalised for personal possession and use. They're in Colorado in the centre and Oregon in the northwest. And then, interestingly, and I'm not sure anybody really quite knows where this came from, but New Mexico has emerged as one of the front runners, the green state there, providing a legal framework for supervised medical use, but not yet passing any laws to decriminalise personal possession or consumption. And then there are these other states where you have decriminalisation but no legal avenue for medical use. And so California, Washington, Michigan and Minnesota are quite interesting in these regards. And I'll just, in the next slide, I'll just go through a little bit of detail as to how that comes to be. But what's happened there is there are certain cities which are working in their own their own ways, sort of somewhat independent, certainly of the federal legal framework, and to a degree the state legal frameworks as well. And this is, I guess, something of a peculiarity of the North American sort of approach. There are three layers of government, which we have, of course, here in Australia. But those three layers of government are, if anything, more independent and they have more enshrined in their constitution, which enables them to undertake these sorts of rescheduling and decriminalisation processes. So here we have, one thing I have to say is that psilocybin and psilocin in the US at the federal level are both strictly illegal. So there's been no rescheduling whatsoever, and in fact on paper the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Food and Drug Administration, to different degrees, can pursue and enforce the federal laws as stringently as previously. However, it's interesting that in quite a number of these states now, we have either statewide rescheduling or decriminalisation, including or excluding legal medical applications. But then we also have quite a number of cities which have passed ordinances, not necessarily legalising or decriminalising so much as requiring their police forces to dramatically reduce the priority of drug charges, drug law enforcement. Okay. And so it's quite interesting. I can't really imagine that happening in Australia somehow, where any city could require the police force at the state level, because of course they have a very different sort of structure of police forces in the US, to require our New South Wales Police, for example, to deprioritise drug law enforcement. Now the key words on the medical use side here are interesting, because assisted adult use is essentially facilitated experiences adult use. Colorado has now essentially totally decriminalised for all adult use, psilocybin, psilocin and a number of other psychedelics as well. But for all that, the Oregon model is not quite a medical model. I find this rather interesting because if I understand the rather hard to read sort of regulations properly, it seems to me that in fact in Oregon it's not permitted to actually provide a psilocybin experience or a facilitated or supervised psilocybin experience as a medical intervention. It's a well-being intervention to maintain people's well-being or for their own exploration, but in fact, as far as I can understand, Oregon and to a lesser extent Colorado actually prevent doctors from administering psilocybin as an acute mental health intervention. Does that seem right from your recollection, Simon? Yeah. For all that, Oregon's been really the trailblazer in this regard. It wasn't the very first in the US, it was actually Denver in Colorado. It was the first city to decriminalise, but Oregon as a state did establish this framework for utilising psilocybin and for the administration of psilocybin. And so there's just a little bit of sort of structural stuff where there's this services section which directs the health authority to do the licensing, oversee manufacturing and so on and so forth. It's not a dispensary model the way that the cannabis model is a dispensary model, so people are not permitted to take psilocybin away from the retreat or the centre for personal use. And of course, as is the case in most of the US, the legal age for any of these is 21, not 18. So it's interesting that a prescription and a referral are not required, but nonetheless they're required. Any individual is required to undergo a preparation session to ensure that they're suitable, that they have a mental condition which is considered to be low risk in relation to psilocybin or other psychedelic experiences, and so on and so forth. The next point is that the psilocybin industry is not intended to be product-centred, but instead it's supposed to be client or patient or participant-centred, which I think is a pretty good way to look at things. It's also interesting that all of the means of ingesting involve natural cultivation and processing of mushrooms. So there's no talk of synthetic psilocybin or any pharmaceutical grade, and I think Oregon in particular has been quite sort of strong and prescriptive in avoiding the encroachment of the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical grade psilocybin. I have slightly different feelings about this, but that's quite alright. I think the Oregon model is still something very much to be considered as a good sort of exemplar for how we could move ahead. So Colorado is slightly different. It actually started out with a very narrow margin of voters in Denver to decriminalise mushrooms in 2019. Remember, of course, that voting is non-compulsory in the US, so we don't actually know what the percentage of total eligible voters was who put that one through. But what they did, as I said earlier, was their trick was to prohibit the Denver city from enabling its police force to enforce the law in relation to mushroom and in fact some other psychedelic drug law enforcement. But then at the state level, then Colorado did follow a few years later in both decriminalising psilocybin and then also legalising the supervised use. I guess I'd have to say that in Australia we do still have a fair way to go in heading in that direction. We're certainly nowhere near that, of course, yet. So apart from decriminalisation in the ACT, of course, possession of psilocybin and mushrooms are both illegal in anywhere else in Australia. Sale, transport, cultivation are illegal at the federal level except for research or clinical use. One thing I can say in support of the Australian system is as a researcher I've found that the the regulations around permits to purchase, to store and to prescribe psychedelics such as psilocybin for clinical research and now clinical application, for medical application, are relatively straightforward, not too onerous at all. And that's not a story we hear about psilocybin or psychedelics in the context of research in most other parts of the world, which is pretty interesting. So our poison standard, which is currently the brand new version 2025, is implemented by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and it's largely enforced and overseen at the federal level with only very limited interpretation and enforcement by the states around Australia. Now, there were rescheduling applications made by a non-profit group starting from 2021, and after 2 rounds of application and 2 rejections the first time, and a half a rejection, which is 1 rejection, and then on review a complete about-face with a triple somersault and a reverse pike, then it came into effect on the 1st of July 23 that psilocybin was legal to be prescribed by authorised prescribers who are psychiatrists who have undergone a requisite amount of training and who have also achieved an ethics committee approval and jumped through a few more hoops. Now can prescribe psilocybin specifically for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression in the context of psychotherapy. Otherwise, psilocybin and psilocin remain as Schedule 9 prohibited substances, and mushrooms remain as prohibited substances as well. So possession and cultivation of psilocybin mushrooms in Australia remains illegal. Now, one thing I have to stress is that the Australian model is very much the medical model, and we haven't moved very far in the way of decriminalisation, which to me just flagrantly overlooks the clear safety profile of psilocybin, of mushrooms, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, I mean, these compounds and mushrooms themselves really should be treated with respect by people who have essentially the mental sort of robustness, I guess, to be able to undergo experiences without risk of personal harm or harm to others as it happens. Now, part of the problem with this medical model at this early stage in Australia is that the rescheduling took place suddenly, surprisingly, and with next to no infrastructure or preparation. And so it's been a bit of a grand experiment. And I guess it's just a testament, actually, to the measured pace of the people actually on the ground, that it hasn't turned into a complete shit show. Essentially, it's been so far a reasonably successful enterprise. What I can say, however, is that the treatment for anybody at this stage is still sitting around the $25,000 to $35,000 for a course of treatment, depending on the number of sessions. Depending on the intervention by psychiatrists versus psychologists and psychotherapists and other trained mental health professionals. From the point of view of the mental health professionals, then the PD itself is quite expensive, it's time consuming, and it's not a simple process to undertake. The administrative burden placed by the TGA is actually not terribly heavy, it's good. And it'll be interesting to see just how this plays. But we're just watching and waiting to see how things come through. At this stage, it's still quite an opaque process. In other words, we don't really know who the practitioners, the authorised prescribers are. We don't know how many people have been treated. We don't know what the outcomes are, because unfortunately the people who have sponsored this whole sort of rescheduling are being very proprietorial about the data. And so at this stage, we're not likely to see any useful data coming out of this for the time being. One thing at least we do have the opportunity to do is work on developing further treatment models. And although the treatment models which are being employed in Australia and are likely to be employed around the world are very much informed by the clinical research that's been taking place over the last 15 to 20 years, there is a lot of scope for the evolution of these treatment models, and that might be things just as simple as 2 versus 3 psilocybin sessions, 2, 3, 4 preparation, integration, and other sessions over whatever period of time. So we can just keep fine-tuning those, and personalising the medicine, which is very much the way things are moving in medical interventions in any case, and particularly mental health interventions. So I'll just sort of finish up by riffing on a few themes now. Maybe just plant some seeds, and I'd welcome, I think I'll probably have about 15-20 minutes over just to questions and general discussion. I really appreciate your thoughts and input. Yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions. So the first one, of course, which I've touched upon a few times in this talk so far, is just that the somewhat contrasting and countervailing sort of considerations, I guess, associated with legalisation of drugs, and usually legalisation within a framework, a therapeutic framework of some kind, versus broader decriminalisation. And certainly medicalisation, which is associated with legalisation, has been considered perhaps a preferable way to legitimise psychedelics and other drugs, including cannabis, in the minds of lawmakers and the community at large. That is debatable, and I always welcome that conversation. I'm no particular expert in that, but I think everybody's probably got an opinion on this. But I think it is interesting to see how different countries and different jurisdictions around the world have sort of addressed this interesting sort of dichotomy, and it does seem to reflect the application of different strategic sort of proclivities, interests, different political climates, different historical factors, and so on and so forth. But if in Australia we did want to move in this direction towards decriminalisation as well as the medicalisation and legalisation, I think we could do very well to really examine what's been taking place in other parts of the world with a degree of success. And so how can we play that? The fact that at this stage, unless I'm mistaken, I think the ACT is still the only jurisdiction in Australia to have essentially decriminalisation for small possession of small amounts for personal use, and that may say something about the ACT. I assume it does, but I'd like to see that there might be some learnings taken from that example and then sort of applied strategically in other parts of Australia. I'm not going to weigh too heavily at all into the psilocybin versus mushroom debate, except to say that in the medical model, and particularly in terms of mental health interventions, the use of a calibrated dose of psilocybin is significantly preferable over the administration of usually dried mushroom biological material, which is extremely difficult to calibrate, can be a bit hard on the stomach, and isn't just everybody's cup of tea, excuse the pun, that wasn't intended. So yeah, there are questions around concerns about impurities and contaminants. Kane, I'm not quite sure the correct word that we're using for the wood lovers sort of factors at the moment. Simon?
Coralin.
Yeah. So there's still some exploration to be done and some research to be done to get to the bottom of some of these current sort of concerns about some species of psilocybin mushrooms, philosophy mushrooms. Natural source versus synthetic versus biosynthetic psilocybin is another interesting one, which tends to come down more to practicalities and economics to a degree. As a sort of a card-carrying biotechnologist, I am very interested in and tend to endorse biosynthesis as one of the approaches to producing excellent, very pure psilocybin at reasonable cost. we're still not quite there yet. There's a small enterprise in Australia that's been working with the CSIRO to see if we could start to implement that financially, but they're not quite there yet, unfortunately. One thing I haven't mentioned here is the fact that essentially globally, particularly in the US and in Australia, it's specified that any pharmaceutical compound must conform to what's called current good manufacturing practice. And that's a form of accreditation and auditing which is designed to absolutely guarantee that any pharmaceutical agent is perfectly safe for human consumption, and it is what it says on the pack. What it does, however, is just adds an incredibly high burden of administrative and cost to any product, and that's quite problematic. That's actually the reason that the biosynthetic psilocybin hasn't been able to get off the ground yet, because of the just totally onerous sort of aspect of GMP accreditation. But I digress. Finally, this has been touched on, I think, in the specific cases of the Oregon and Colorado experiments. Whether medical application of psilocybin or any psychedelic in broad societal use is the absolute preeminent sort of application, or whether there's a perfectly valid intention on the part of individuals to explore religious and spiritual aspects, or for their own personal development, the broadening of their own personal experience, which arguably is something that makes us human as well, as much as any medical application. And so I think this comes back to the legalisation, decriminalisation aspects, but these are all just things to think about as we move ahead. And then I was also interested in the implications for other psychedelics. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, I gave a talk not so long ago here, a couple of years ago, entitled Beyond Psilocybin, and in fact I've just curated a journal, special research topic issue of a journal in Frontiers in Psychiatry, which was encouraging researchers to communicate about their own research into compounds beyond psilocybin. So I've called psilocybin the gateway psychedelic, and I think there's plenty of scope to explore, and I'm happy to say that there is quite a lot of active research globally now looking at other closely related and some much more distantly related compounds, including the neuroplastogens or psychoplastogens, which are these non-psychedelic serotonin receptor agonists that Simon was discussing earlier. So lots of interesting stuff in there, and lots of scope to move ahead. I feel in the short term we have plenty of potential in Australia to move things along. So in fact there's a follow-up application to broaden psilocybin use in medical practice to existential distress or depression, anxiety associated with terminal illness. And also the broadening of authorised prescribers, therefore, to encompass palliative care physicians in addition to psychiatrists, specifically speaking. Perhaps a slight negative, or something of a negative, is the definite sort of move in or encroachment of pharmaceutical company interests. Usually at the moment they're quite small pharmaceutical companies, because the big pharmaceutical companies, apart from Johnson & Johnson, that's making ridiculous amounts of profit on Spravato, which is one of the ketamine preparations. The big companies at this stage still don't have the risk appetite to weigh in very heavily into R&D in psychedelic research. There are elements of funding models which are still very much to be nutted out, so we've got a long way to go. In terms of the involvement of medical insurance in Australia, the medical benefit scheme and the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, system scheme, and also, interestingly enough, the Department of Veterans Affairs is starting to move, or is moving now, towards supporting these as well. In the US, the Food and Drug Administration has turned out to be not so compliant, and I use that word carefully and advisedly, as the Therapeutic Goods Administration. In fact, the FDA rejected a very strong, otherwise very strong application for MDMA to be approved in the same way that psilocybin is approved, and MDMA is approved in Australia. specifically for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder in the context of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And that has set the global scene back probably 2 to 3, maybe 5 years. And that was a disappointment, but in retrospect, I think it vindicated our concerns about what's been going on in Australia. But nonetheless, it was a bit of a shame. Interestingly enough, Oregon and Colorado both have a number of cities within those states which are opting out of the statewide psychedelic decriminalisation move. So there are certain cities which still have enough autonomy, well, they all have autonomy to a degree, and they are resisting that move towards broad-scale decriminalisation. And I think that is a good testament to the flexibility, I guess I could say, of the North American system and the mindset overall. And then finally, I think there are likely to be shifts coming through, in further shifts in Canada and also the beginnings of shifts in Europe. And I think that that may accelerate in the current global political climate. So I guess we'll just have to watch and wait and see what comes up. But it's it's an interesting space. As I say, almost every year, there's never been a more exciting time to be involved in psychedelic research. So yeah. Just some final thoughts. I do feel that there is so much research taking place now. I'm very happy to say that the evidence is always accumulating in favour of the efficacy of psychedelics as a mental health intervention. Nonetheless, I think there's my sort of little crystal ball, which is usually pretty hazy, I have to say, but right at the moment it seems to be crystal clear to me that all of these pressures of just a growing population, the impacts on environment and the planet, our increasing secularism as a humanity, and a loss of sort of touch with so many aspects of our internal spirit. These are really going to accelerate the movement towards acceptance of and preparedness to explore psychedelic spaces and mind-body states. I think a really salient point is if there's a way for us to move towards a maintenance model of mental health and well-being, that wouldn't be a bad way to go. The analogy I like to use is I take my car every year or whatever, every 15,000 km for maintenance and oil change, just to make sure that a wheel isn't going to fall off. Not to say that it hasn't fallen off, but a wheel's not going to fall off. It's not going to fall apart on the road, whatever it might be. Rather than the acute intervention that is required when things go wrong, quite often as a consequence of a lack of maintenance and sort of program maintenance. And so it's very much my feeling that we could all benefit to a greater or lesser degree by these kinds of sort of just general sort of tune-up from time to time. Whatever it might be, psychedelics obviously not for everybody, but in certain cases I think we could all benefit from these. Just a few final throwaway thoughts. The increasing, it seems the inexorably increasing influence of influencers and opinion leaders in certain parts of the world may or may not shift things in a positive direction. I'm not quite sure. Haven't heard much from Gwyneth Paltrow about psychedelics recently, but you just never quite know, do you? And then there's actually increasing interest now in things like VR, virtual reality, mind hacking, and the tech bros, the Silicon Valley technocrats seem to be having a bit of a part to play in that. But yeah, lots of stuff for us to watch this space. So, thanks so much for your attention. It's been lovely to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was fantastic. I wanted to open the floor up to questions. Who wants to go first? Oh, I haven't seen this before. Yep, maybe I'll go there next time. Here first.
Hi, Martin. Just hypothetically, if I had treatment-resistant depression and I didn't have $25,000 to hand, where out of those countries would you think would be the best place for me to go in relation to price and jurisdiction?
I wish I'd had a chance to look more closely at some of the finer details, but I guess one thing that we could say about some of these, I guess the Caribbean countries, Mexico, interestingly enough, and the reason I mentioned Mexico is that Simon mentioned a compound called ibogaine or ibogaine, and Mexico has been the site of a number of retreats over the last 20, 30 or more years for ibogaine treatment, particularly for opiate addiction and so on. It is legal in New Zealand. In fact, there's an interesting little legal sort of little glitch in the matrix in Australia, which enables ibogaine as a compound to be legal, but iboga is controlled. One thing I can say is that the US and to a much lesser degree Australia, but to a small degree Australia, have philanthropic structures and frameworks and predispositions which are inclined to provide the kind of support that for people who don't have the means to explore those options themselves. One country I probably quite obviously haven't mentioned is the UK in this presentation, and the UK is sadly lagging in this area, and there just seems to be this staunch resistance to accepting any sort of evidence and any progress, which is such a shame, because the NHS, for all its shortcomings, could well be a great way to support this kind of intervention. For its own citizens, Switzerland, I'm sure, is a great place for them to be treated, as is Australia. Yeah. But yeah, I wish I had just a nice quick answer for you. Yeah.
I'm sure the Nimbin Hospital will treat you on the public healthcare system. This lovely gentleman here has got a question.
Oh, you've got that.
Thanks for the overview. You are very familiar with all of this and have thought about it a lot. What's your ideal model in Australia look like? What if you could make it happen any way you wanted to? What would it be?
Sure. With all respect, I'd probably broaden it beyond psychiatrists. I do think that's obviously for those psychiatrists who are interested and motivated to be involved. I think that's there's certainly lots of scope, but I would like to see things move more into the community health sort of realm. I think we have tremendous, fantastic sort of training in place for a broad range of medical practitioners and mental health professionals, and so I'd like to see that taking place. One thing I didn't get to mention in relation to the Australian model, but the variation among states when this rescheduling of psilocybin first happened, was that the New South Wales Department of Health and Human Services Department of Health, in its wisdom, basically said this can only happen in a public hospital environment with inpatient facilities that's willing to sort of put patients up and treat them. And there just clearly weren't those facilities in New South Wales, and so it was never going to happen. And it's really hard to know whether that was a deliberate ploy on the part of the New South Wales Department of Health, or whether it was just a sort of a by-the-by. But I think opening it up to community clinics, and that's I've had a paper on that, and all of their translational aspects are very important. Sorry, I'm answering your question, Simon. And so if we can open it up, broaden it, and also incorporate the MBS and medical insurance as quickly as possible. I was actually asked, and I've said this a couple of years ago here as well. I was invited by Swiss Re, which is one of the reinsurance companies which insures the insurance companies, to give a presentation on psychedelic assisted therapies as a mental health intervention. As far as I know, they took notes and they were very cordial about it. But as far as I know, nothing's really happened yet. They can't see the compelling argument at this stage to support, to provide medical insurance support yet. But I'm hoping it's coming, and I think it is coming.
I think that man was highly anxious about when he could get books.
Have we got a question?
So I've got one here from Richard.
Yep.
We've got books up here, haven't we?
The whole bookshop.
In the embassy, there's
There's a bookshop up there.
bookshop. Yes. Now this lovely man.
Thank you. I just wanted to rip off. Hello. Just wanted to rip off a few things. I think sorry. A few things you mentioned. I think the New Mexico thing maybe because of Rick Strassman's work. Potentially.
Yep,
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. And just in terms of the whole TRD, treatment-resistant depression thing, and the cohort, as it were, for ketamine-assisted therapy, so Spravato, and also ketamine hydrochloride. There was an article today in Conversation where they mentioned, I can't remember the author, but some academic mentioned it's a 30,000 strong cohort in Australia at the moment, just for that particular, shall we say, ailment. And funnily enough, I was actually lucky enough to get a job with an AP that does ketamine, so ketamine clinic, down by non-disclosure, so I won't say too much about it. But in answer to your question, where's the most cost-effective place to go internationally? South Africa. When you mentioned Ibogaine or Ibogaine, again, legal over there. It's going to be much cheaper for you to go to a clinic over there. Cambodia Awakenings on Instagram, for instance, they're legally allowed to advertise it. The cost of the flight there, accommodation, doing a full-blown retreat, 3-5 days, whatever it is, all of that is going to be significantly cheaper than your 25 to 33, 35 grand, whatever it is, for MDMA psilocybin treatment in Australia. I can tell you the costs for the ketamine treatment as a course run roughly the same. Again, I won't sort of mention explicit numbers. But the DVA, I'll tell you now, is very keen to fund, particularly war vets, with ketamine, far more than with cannabis. And that's a societal perception thing, I think. Cannabis being, the devil's lettuce, ketamine being orthodox ketamine, so it comes down to societal perception. That's why I think Ibogaine, which I know Martin's been, and Prism have been interested in for a long time. I think that's a diamond in the rough in terms of my treatment. That's all. Thank you.
No, thanks.
Yes, the man here wants to ask a question. Is it how to get books or something? What is it, young man?
Let's do it. No.
I'm sure Elon Musk is doing a lot for ketamine at the moment.
I just wanted to get some information because a lot of these names they're scientific names I'm going to forget. So I'd just like to get some material, reading material on this, like maybe a couple of books or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
I'd like to read a bit more about it because I'm going to forget. I was trying to remember the name. It's still kind of
Psilocybin.
Oh, psilocybin, okay.
Yeah. It's just
well, look,
Or was it LSD?
Yeah.
You first got to be Michael Pollan's book if you haven't read. Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, and it's just a fun read. He's a great writer, and he's changed a lot of people's minds. Happy to say. So I'd strongly encourage you to use that as your starting point, and then he talks about psilocybin, he talks about MDMA, he talks about the research and future prospects. It's well worth the read. Give it a go. Yeah, absolutely.
You
Very welcome, thanks.
Excuse me, sir.
All right. Obviously, the Hemp Embassy bookshop. We should all support the Hemp Embassy. The Hemp Embassy have pretty much made all this happen.